Congress, which will essentially wrap up tomorrow. We'll take it back now to the floor of the House.
The nays are 9.
I opened it back up.
Mr. Hall.
Votes aye.
Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Gingrey of Georgia.
Votes aye.
Mr. Gingrey of Georgia votes aye. Mr. McKeon.
Votes aye.
Mr. McKeon votes aye.
It just changed again. It's changing like crazy. They got
I know. I'm just watching people come in.
All right.
Thank you.
Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mr. McDermott.
He is off aye on no.
Off aye on no for Mr. McDermott.
You check Richmond? Aye. Closed. Had locked. Second card.
Ms. Bass of California.
She votes aye.
Ms. Bass of California votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
He votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
You ready to try it? Yeah.
On this vote, the ayes are 408, the nays are 10. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
House will be in order. Would members clear the well, clear the aisles? Let the House be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp,
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 844, I call up the bill H.R. 8 with the Senate amendments thereto, and I have a motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the bill, designate the Senate amendments, and designate the motion.
H.R. 8, an act to extend certain tax relief provisions enacted in 2001 and 2003, and to provide for expedited consideration of a bill providing for comprehensive tax reform and for other purposes. Senate amendments. Motion by Mr. Camp.
Pursuant to House Resolution 844, the motion shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 8.
Without objection.
And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge what a colleague from Georgia called a legacy vote, making permanent the tax cuts Republicans enacted back in 2001 and 2003. I couldn't agree more. And let me say why. Because we're making permanent tax policies Republicans originally crafted. Now, back then, despite having a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and a Republican in the White House, those policies were only temporary. That's because Democrats refused to join Republicans in providing tax relief for working families. Well, after more than a decade of criticizing these tax cuts, Democrats are finally joining with Republicans in making these tax cuts permanent. Republicans and the American people are getting something really important: permanent tax relief. As big as that is, and it's only the first step when it comes to taxes, this legislation settles the level of revenue Washington should bring in. Next, we need to make the tax code simpler and fairer for families and small businesses. And we need to pursue comprehensive and fundamental tax reform to create the jobs we need and to make American businesses and workers competitive in the global marketplace. Simply put, the tax code is a nightmare. It's too complex, too time-consuming, and too costly. About 60% of individual taxpayers have to hire others to do their tax returns because the code is too complicated. As a result, if tax compliance were an industry, it would be one of the largest in the United States and would consume 6.1 billion hours, the equivalent of more than 3 million full-time workers. And yes, it's too costly. In 2008 alone, taxpayers spent $163 billion complying with the individual and corporate income tax rules. Add to that the fact that the U.S. has the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD and an outdated worldwide system of taxation, and it's not too difficult to imagine why many don't view America as an attractive place to invest and hire. Nothing about the bill we're considering tonight changes any of those realities. That's why the Ways and Means Committee will pursue comprehensive tax reform in the next Congress. So by making Republican tax cuts permanent, we're one step closer to comprehensive tax reform that will help strengthen our economy and create more and higher paychecks for American workers. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and get us one step closer to tax reform, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
This is a bipartisan bill, and I will try to keep it within that spirit to the extent possible. As we are here today on January 1, hours away from people, Americans returning to work, markets reopening around the world, and all eyes focusing on whether this institution can govern. This legislation allows us to get done what we need to get done. This bill is vital for our nation's economic well-being, and I want to emphasize, for its standing as the world's most important economy. It is vital for 114 million middle-class families whose tax cuts are made permanent. It's vital for 2 million unemployed American workers who need continuation of their insurance while they continue to look for work. It is vital for 30 million middle-income Americans who otherwise would have been hit by the alternative minimum tax. And it's vital for 25, and I emphasize this, 25 million working families and students who benefit from the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which helps families pay for college. And it's vital for physicians and millions of their patients who would have been hurt by drastic cuts in Medicare reimbursement rates. It's also vital for businesses through an extension of important tax provisions such as the R&D credit, and also renewable energy incentives that must continue in this great country of ours, and bonus depreciation to encourage business investments. But I want to emphasize this somewhat in contrast to what our chairman has said. This legislation breaks the iron barrier that for far too long has prevented additional tax revenues from the very wealthiest. It raises $620 billion in revenue by achieving the President's goal of asking the wealthiest 2% of Americans to pay more while protecting 98% of families. That's right, that's what it does, and 97%, I want to emphasize this, contrary to propaganda coming from the other side, 97% of small businesses from any tax increase. And lastly, and this needs to be emphasized, especially in view, Mr. Chairman, of your comments, this package is vital for future deficit reduction efforts, setting the stage for a balanced approach from here on out by delaying sequestration through one-to-one revenue to spending cuts. Yesterday, President Obama again said he is committed to deficit reduction, but he emphasized several times, and I quote, that we've got to do this in a balanced, responsible way with additional revenues as well as spending cuts. So, I urge its passage. This bill sets the important precedent I mentioned in terms of additional revenues as well as spending cuts. The time is urgent. The time is now. We should support this legislation. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
At this time, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
That's unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be speaking for this bill, but I can't. In the 12 years, almost to the day, that I've served in this body, I've voted for every tax cut. And I remember many of my colleagues, many of them friends to my right here, who each time we voted for them said, where does the pay go? Where's the pay for? Well, Mr. Speaker, there's $4 trillion of new debt and deficit, and there's no pay for. And there's no anticipation of a pay for. In the last night, or the last 2 days of a Congress, to say that 2 months from now a new Congress is going to do what we're not doing here today is not something I can bring myself to do. I would like to vote for this because I do vote for lower taxes. I want Americans to have lower taxes. But the other day in conference, one of my colleagues pointed out that if in fact you're spending the money, you're taxing our future generation. We are taxing $1.2 trillion next year. We are taxing $1.2 trillion. We won't collect it, but we are taxing $1.2 trillion of deficit. The chairman of the committee, of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Camp, rightfully so said, we're also not simplifying the tax code. We're not making it better or fairer. We're not getting rid of the NASCAR loophole. We're not getting rid of the electric motor scooter low-speed loophole. We're not getting rid of a whole lot of tax things that are here. But most importantly, we're not taking things that the President himself said he would be for, like getting the calculation of chain CPI, of the Consumer Price Index for Social Security and federal workforce and pensions right, which would in fact reduce the deficit going forward. So because of what we're not doing, I cannot believe that this tax cut will in fact be followed with the spending cuts to offset any part of the $4 trillion we're putting on the backs of future generations. So I thank all of you who will vote for it. I cannot bring myself to vote for it tonight, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
We Democrats said on Ways and Means time after time when Republicans passed tax cuts and never brought $1 to the table to pay for them. They thought that that was a way to promote economic growth. How wrong they were. It's now my privilege to yield 1 minute to a person who has the title leader, but who has been so much more than a titular leader, who has valiantly led our efforts, and we owe to Nancy Pelosi a real debt of gratitude for our being where we are today. With real pleasure, I yield 1 minute to our distinguished leader, the gentlelady from California.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his great leadership as our ranking member on the Ways and Means Committee and for bringing the clarity to our thinking on this important subject that we are dealing with this evening. My colleagues, many of us this morning began the day with the Vice President of the United States coming to the Democratic caucus and speaking to us about legislation that passed the Senate last night, 89-8. That is absolutely historic. It was legislation that he helped negotiate working with the Republican and Democratic leaders in the United States Senate. It was a remarkable accomplishment because, as we all know, while we share the same goals, we sometimes have different paths to achieving them. And reconciling our differences was a monumental task, especially with the time growing short. So we appreciate the leadership. We appreciate the leadership of the Vice President. We appreciate the leadership of the Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate. And we thank Speaker Boehner for bringing this legislation to the floor. Hopefully, we can duplicate the strong bipartisan vote that the legislation received in the United States Senate. And why is that important? It's important because the American people told us in the election they wanted us to work together. They have their differences too. They understand disagreement. They also understand compromise. And that is what this legislation represents. I listened attentively to the previous speaker who said he was voting for the bill for what was not in it. That's an interesting approach. We can judge all of the legislation that we vote on for what it is in it, or vote against it for what is not in it. But at some point, you strike a balance. You balance the equities. Where do you come out in terms of making a choice? And I hope the choice that the American people will make tonight is to vote. We will reflect the will and heed the call of the American people to work together and follow the lead of the Senate with a strong bipartisan support. What do they want us to do? What are their priorities? They want us to create jobs. They want us to grow the economy. They want us to invest in education. They want us to reduce the deficit. They want us to strengthen the middle class. And that is what this legislation does. It does so in a way that is not complete, but is an important first step. We talked much about what would happen all the gloom and doom of what would happen if we went over the cliff. Well, let's talk instead about what happens if we don't go over the cliff. And I believe that we will not, seeing the vote on the rule this evening. I believe that we will heed the American people, come together with a strong vote. We will increase, by voting for this legislation and passing it in a strong bipartisan way, will increase the confidence of consumers, of the markets, of businesses, of employers to hire more. We will extend unemployment insurance to people who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. This is very, very important, not only to those individuals, but to our economy, because this is money that is spent immediately, injecting demand into the economy, creating jobs. We will extend permanent tax relief for the middle class. For more than 98% of American taxpayers, more than 97% of America's small businesses. We will support our middle class, strengthen it by supporting child tax credits, credits for higher education, American Opportunity credits, earned income tax credit, and the like. Our distinguished ranking member went through some of the provisions, but it's important to see them in light of what they mean to America's working families. And by doing this, by voting for this agreement, we will demonstrate that we have listened to the American people, we have heeded their call once again to work together in a bipartisan way. I want to salute President Obama. He campaigned on strengthening the middle class. I think all of us probably did, and this is one way for us to fulfill that promise. Yes, to all of those who say this doesn't, all the other things that don't happen in the bill. No, I don't know any piece of legislation that I've ever voted for that did everything that I thought it should do. But this is a very, very strong first step as we go into the new year. Let us send a message to the American people that, again, while this bill doesn't accomplish all that we need to do to grow the economy, reduce the deficit, and strengthen the middle class, it is a good way for us to have a happy start to a new year by taking this first step. I hope that as, again, you balance the equities, the pros and cons of this legislation, that you will weigh heavily in favor of the message that it sends to the kitchen tables of America about the respect we have for them, meeting their needs, meeting their challenges, honoring their aspirations. This great middle class is the backbone of our democracy. Let us all be very patriotic tonight, support our middle class, support our democracy. Vote aye on this strong bipartisan legislation which passed 89-8 in the United States Senate. Let's step up to the plate to do that in the House of Representatives. I urge my colleagues to vote aye and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 45 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
This is the first step. And now that we have permanently settled how much revenue the government's going to take out of the economy, we can move on to next steps. We can and will pursue comprehensive tax reform this year in 2013. And next steps, we need to address the fundamental drivers of our deficits and debt, and that is out-of-control spending. And with that, I urge support for this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
I just don't want the chairman's statement that this settles permanently how much revenue will be made available. The President has made clear there has to be a balanced approach, and no one should be misled into thinking otherwise. No one. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection.
Well, this is no profile in courage for me to be voting for this bill. Reminds me of the jokes we used to have on Lenox Avenue where someone stopped hitting you in the head with a hammer and you're supposed to say thank you so much for the relief. We created this monster. We're the ones that have said, at least the Congress has said in the majority in the House, that do what you have to do, but for God's sake, don't ask the top 2% of the wealthiest people in this civilized country to pay their fair share. And while you're thinking about taxing people, why don't you start talking about cutting people off from unemployment compensation? Why don't you think about not providing so much for the sick and the ages? Why don't you start privatizing these things? This was not the America that I knew when I came to the Congress. This was something that people, a handful of people from nowhere, came here and started preaching that we had to destroy big government. And the vulnerable, who had no lobbyists, who had no one to come to, were saved by us, by responsible people who came together and said, basically, have you lost your mind? What are you doing? How can you go home and tell the people this is what you created? And so we paused, and common sense has prevailed. And we can at least go back home and say, not now. But they're coming again. They have all types of words that they're using, like the debt ceiling. But all it means is that they're coming after us and they're coming after the president. They'll be talking about sequestration. What will it mean? Cutting benefits off of people who need them the most. And with all due regards to the other body for once doing what the House could not get together and doing, we never even saw how they paid for some of these things. Things that we would have handled differently when we had to pay for those doctors who worked very hard for the Medicare. And people say, well, how are you paying for them? And everyone had amnesia in not knowing. Well, after it's over, they'll get paid, but this Congress will make certain that the providers of health care are not penalized for this Congress doing the right thing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank so many on the other side after all these years for finally acknowledging publicly that 98% of the Bush tax cuts helped the middle class. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I will yield to my temptation to respond, and I will now yield 2 minutes to another distinguished gentleman, member of our committee, Mr. Neal of Massachusetts.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. And at this late hour, let me point something out and take exception to what Chairman Camp said at the outset of his remarks. We're here tonight because, despite what the gentleman from Texas just said as well, you can't cut taxes by $2.3 trillion over 12 years and fight 2 wars. When you heard the argument before that was so popular, it's the people's money. It's going to promote economic growth, the most anemic economic growth that America's had since Hoover became president. Do you know what's the people's responsibility? Those veterans' hospitals. 1,700,000 new veterans, 45,000 wounded. And do you know what the Republican whip said during those crucial years? Cutting taxes in a time of war is patriotic. So much for sacrifice for all of us. When you look back into how we got to this problem, revenue at 15% of GDP, that's an Eisenhower figure headed toward Truman. We've argued in this town about 19 to 21% for the better part of 30 years. 15% of revenue at GDP, 12 years of tax cuts. Now, this represents a reasonable step forward tonight. And I want to say with some personal satisfaction, I'm delighted with what we have finally done to put to rest alternative minimum tax. 1 million families in Massachusetts were threatened with alternative minimum tax. It was the responsible position tonight. But I want to give you a number. You know what these patches have cost us? $2.2 trillion over the life of AMT. The theology that we heard that was so popular in this institution, tax cuts pay for themselves. You can't find a mainstream economist today in America that will acknowledge that problem. This is a reasonable step forward. vote for this measure, and let's get on to fundamental tax reform.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Blumenauer. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. This evening we're expected to vote on an item that has many commendable and important items. Unfortunately, too many are of short duration, much is left out, and most importantly, we're losing a real opportunity for reform. The SGR is left in a year to torment medical providers again. The ATM, I'm pleased, is patched, and I appreciate the advocacy of my friend Mr. Neal. But in fact, we all know that it should at a minimum be reformed, if not repealed. We have a body blow to the alternative energy industry, and somehow it's given a year's reprieve, but it's not what they need or what they deserve. And because we refuse at a moment of opportunity to deal meaningfully with the national debt. And remember, the budget from my Republican friends, authored by my colleague Mr. Ryan, would have required $6 trillion headroom in the debt ceiling. Now, we cannot continue to have the world's largest and most expensive military by far, the lowest taxes of any of the major economies, the most expensive and inefficient health care, and continue to allow our country's infrastructure to fall apart while America ages and grows. This proposal represents absolutely the least we could have done under these circumstances, and tragically institutionalizes for the next Congress the madness around here of short-term frenzy around self-inflicted deadlines that have no reality to them. That drives the American public crazy, and with good reason. Not only can we do better, I would suggest that we must do better. May I have 20 more seconds?
Surely, 20 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 20 seconds.
It's probably going to pass with overwhelming bipartisan support. So be it. I can only hope that that spirit of taking a risk on both sides of the aisle, and both parties and the administration, that the Obama administration and the new Congress get serious about reform and delivering services more cost-effectively in ways, ironically, that people on both sides of the aisle agree with, but are absent in this proposal. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I reserve.
He reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Now, I yield 2 minutes to another member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Pasquale of New Jersey.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
The American people are the real winners here tonight, not anyone who navigates these halls. Let's make that clear. We don't have a perfect bill in front of us. In fact, we've never had a perfect bill in front of us. But this is a bill which will provide the much-needed certainty to millions of middle-class American families that their income taxes will not increase. Since the recession in 2008, there's been a 25% increase in the number of families below the poverty line in my home state of New Jersey. I'm sure we'll see more as a result of the devastation of Hurricane Sandy. Lest we forget before tomorrow that we need to respond to that storm as all of us responded to the other catastrophes over the past 10 to 15 years. We should not have exceptions, particularly from those states who are donor states. If you want to get into nickels and dimes, then let's get into nickels and dimes. We've done our share, and we'll continue to do it. We want everybody to step up to the plate. We've been able to help families in need by extending the Earned Income Tax Credit to 563,000 New Jersey taxpayers who earn an average of will earn an average of $2,169 more because of the program. We have also helped 460,000 New Jersey families take advantage of the child tax credit. Many of you, regardless of which state you come from, your constituents have taken advantage of that great program. And almost 400,000 have been able to use the education tax credits. Least we forget what we've done on the alternative minimum tax. The chairman will tell you of the Ways and Means Committee how many times alternative minimum tax comes up. And yet we did nothing about it, pushing it patch to patch, year to year. In just one county in my district, 87% of the families
I yield
would
an additional 30 seconds.
I ask you to have a yea vote on this legislation so we could all be proud and be happy for a change when we wake up in the morning. Thank you.
I reserve.
Mr. Camp reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to Allison Schwartz, our colleague to be on Ways and Means from Pennsylvania.
Where? Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I rise this evening in strong support of the Jobs Protection and Recession Prevention Act of 2012. By passing this bill, Congress provides economic security and certainty for middle-class families. This legislation, which passed the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, permanently extends tax cuts for 99% of American families and small businesses. It protects seniors' access to doctors, it expands affordability for college for millions of young people, and it makes vital investments that build economic growth and new jobs in this country. And it averts the fiscal cliff and the harmful economic consequences that might have resulted. As we close out this Congress, we've reached resolution on a major issue facing this Congress and our nation: fair tax policy for our families and our businesses. There's more work to do, and in the next Congress, my guess is that it will be just as difficult to reach bipartisan solutions. But that doesn't mean it can't be done, and tonight's vote, I hope, demonstrates that, in fact, it can, and it benefits American families and American businesses and America's future. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I'll still reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So tonight we will pass 83 provisions that remove federal revenue, totaling $3.9 trillion, all of it deficit financed. Now, we will add $64 billion more this year to reducing the deficit. So if we have a $1.3 trillion annual deficit this year, it'll bring it down to $1.24 trillion. Now, many of us feel, certainly on this side, that deficit doesn't matter. But it does matter because we have another deficit. A deficit in the investment in the education of our children, an investment in the training and skills of our workforce, and the physical infrastructure of our country. And we will have none of those resources to make that investment after we make this vote tonight. And the problem is we set up 3 more fiscal cliffs. We're going to have to deal with the debt ceiling. We're going to have to deal with the continuing resolution expiration, and we're going to have to deal with the sequester. And all that's left is spending cuts. So the only question we have to ask ourselves is, what programs do we cut and how deep do we cut them? We're going to look back on this night and regret it, notwithstanding the fact that 95% of us apparently will vote for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman's prepared to close. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to support this bill because essentially we have 2 choices here. We either vote for this bill and we prevent us from going over the cliff, or we go over the cliff, and that would certainly wreak havoc with the markets, with everything else. But it never should have come to this. We should have been negotiating and passing a balanced bill. The American people are really fed up with what they see in the dysfunctional Congress. And you know, Harry Truman, back in 1948, when he was running for president, campaigned against the 80th, and he called it the do-nothing 80th Congress. That do-nothing Congress passed 3 times as many bills as the 112th Congress did. And so here we are at the last minute, and we are rushing to pass this bill. It never should have happened this way. I commend President Obama and Vice President Biden for protecting the middle class with this, for doing the best that they can. But my friends and my colleagues, we are going to have to work to meet in a sensible center. We are going to have to not play these brinkmanship games. The American people don't want it. President Obama won re-election campaigning for the middle class. This keeps those priorities, and we ought to support it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, continues to reserve. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to Danny Davis, our colleague from Illinois, and soon rejoining us on Ways and Means.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I've never seen a compromise where everybody got everything that they wanted or liked everything that they got. I certainly don't like everything that I see in this bill, and I certainly didn't get everything that I wanted. But I do like the fact that senior citizens can go to the doctors because they're being paid a reasonable rate. I don't like the fact that some of the health programs in my communities and disproportionate hospitals all across the country are being cut. I just got 2 phone calls a few minutes ago from 2 constituents, one from Oak Park, Illinois, one from Westchester. And they both did all that they could do to convince me to vote against this bill. And after listening to them, I thanked them, but then I told them, do you know that 320,000 people in our state relied upon unemployment insurance benefits last year? I don't know how I could face those individuals with no hope, no possibility, no idea that they're going to have a check in the mail. But when I go to church on Sunday, I know that I will see people with the assurance that pretty soon an unemployment check is in the mail. And that's one of the reasons that, yes, I will vote for this bill, because it's good legislation. People need it right now, not next year, not next month, not next week. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now, with pleasure, yield 3 minutes to another member of our leadership, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, it's tempting to say it's about time the House put aside extreme partisanship and work together on a compromise to address the nation's most pressing issues. But in reality, it is far past time that we put aside extreme partisanship. Throughout the entirety of the 112th Congress, we have seen narrow political interests placed ahead of the public interest. So here we are on New Year's night with the clock running out on the very existence of this Congress, finally considering bipartisan legislation to provide middle-class tax cuts, require the wealthiest to once again pay their fair share so we can grow the economy, create jobs, and protect the most vulnerable in our society. It is indeed well past time we got about the people's business. Mr. Speaker, in 2011, I served on the Biden group of both Republican and Democratic representatives and senators who worked with the Vice President on our nation's fiscal issues. We made good progress in those talks until our Republican friends walked away, fearing the wrath of the Tea Party. I also served on the Bipartisan Joint Select Committee on deficit reduction, the so-called super committee that spent countless hours discussing these issues in detail. It was very clear that the elements of a fair and balanced fiscal plan were achievable. But at the end of the process, the Republican leaders refused to compromise, and the super committee failed. So here we are. While this is not a perfect bill, and I have serious concerns about some of the cuts it contains, it does contain the element of fairness. This bill protects the middle class.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 60 seconds.
Thank you. This bill protects the middle class and working people with a more progressive tax code than we've had in a very long time. And this bill prevents the Meat Act's approach of budget cuts that could do more severe damage to our national defense and important domestic priorities. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the partisanship of the 112th Congress will end this week with the end of the 112th Congress. And I am hopeful that the 113th Congress can work together toward honorable compromises that get the people's business done. I urge a yes vote. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Well, we're going to vote soon. But first, we want to hear from our whip, the distinguished gentleman from Maryland who has worked so hard on these issues for decades, Mr. Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman for his leadership.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for how much time?
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
And I thank Mr. Camp for his leadership. There is, of course, a time for partisanship. There is a time for making our political points. And that time has been, and it will be again. That time is not tonight. All of us have traveled throughout this country, and we have heard our constituents and our neighbors and our friends say, please don't have us go over the cliff. They're not sure exactly what going over the cliff means, but they intuitively and deeply feel that it will not be good to go over that cliff. And so we come to this floor tonight with almost everyone who has spoken and said this bill is not perfect. And of course that observation could be applied to any and all bills that we consider in this House. Compromise is not the art of perfection. By its very definition, a compromise contains elements that neither side likes. But it also contains pieces both sides can embrace. What we will do tonight is not only adopt a piece of legislation that will give literally tens of millions of Americans the assurance that their taxes will not be raised, millions of small businesses that their taxes will not be raised, millions of people who, through no fault of their own, are struggling to find a job and try to keep bread on their table. The assurance that we will be there to help. Tonight we will come together and do something else. With 37.5 hours left to go in the 112th Congress, we will display to all of our constituents that yes, in the final analysis, we have the ability to come together, to act not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans. 435 of us sent here by our neighbors and friends to try to do the best we can, realizing that there are 435 points of view that sit in this chamber. And that what we strive to do is to reconcile those differences to create consensus. For without consensus, democracy cannot work. There will be time for partisan differences. There will be time for partisan confrontation in the days in the 113th Congress. But this night, as we end the 112th Congress, as we have strived mightily to come to an agreement with great difficulty, and realizing that all of us have very strong feelings, I severely regret that this is not a big, bold, balanced plan.
I yield 2 minutes to the
The gentleman is
gentleman.
recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
I regret that this is not a big, bold, and balanced plan. We had an opportunity to reach such an agreement in a bipartisan fashion. And we will not reach a big, bold, and balanced plan without bipartisanship, because the decisions we will have to make will be too difficult not to be done in a bipartisan fashion. But this night, we take a step, a positive step. And the people watching us, Mr. Speaker, on television tonight and reading about their Congress tomorrow and seeing that we were able to act, not perfectly, but in a bipartisan fashion, to try to take a step towards fiscal responsibility, fiscal stability, and yes, caring for those who most need our help in this country. And so I urge my colleagues, as the leader of my party in this Congress urged us, to support this legislation, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican, but as an American who understands that our people believe that action is necessary. And I would urge all of us, as we close this debate, to do so in a way that brings us together, not drive us apart, that reaches out to the best in us, not to the partisan in us. Mr. Speaker, it is time for this Congress to come together, address this issue, and act together and pass this bill. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Back his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what gets lost in the 30-second sound bites on the fiscal cliff is the real cliff facing this country in the form of a massive wave of entitlement obligations. Government accounting doesn't tell the whole story. The actual liabilities of the federal government, the present value of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security programs already exceed $86 trillion. By 2040, our entitlement obligations will consume all of the average post-war projected tax revenue. We have to come to grips with that. That means every dollar collected by the IRS would go to pay Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid without reforms. We will have to go out and borrow to pay for other spending, should that happen. It is unfortunate that the President wasn't willing to engage on this front, and it is unfortunate that the Senate leader continues to deny the crisis. On the day of the New Year's resolutions, let's hope Senator Reid and President Obama resolve to be honest about the crisis our nation faces with the coming wave of entitlement obligations, making these programs solvent and reining in these trillion-dollar deficits, which every economist will tell you is unsustainable. This must be done in 2013. But without the legislation before us today, without this bill, millions of Americans would see their tax rates go up, and that would provide a systemic shock to our already weak economy. This plan that we're about to vote on locks in a reduced tax rate for middle-class families who otherwise would have seen $3,000 in higher taxes on average. It permanently holds down the death tax, which impacts so many small businesses. It permanently protects the middle class from the alternative minimum tax, and it adjusts that for inflation. The plan does away with a new entitlement program created in Obamacare, and it makes permanent a 15% capital gains and dividends rate for income up to $400,000 for singles, and $450,000 for married couples, and a 20% rate for those above. That rate would have gone to 39.6% for dividends. That would have been very injurious for our capital markets. That would be very injurious for economic growth if we allowed that to happen. So tax relief has been achieved. Now is the time for the President to work with Congress to address government overspending, the underlying problem. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Are you ready to close? I'll do the same. You know, I regret the last statements. It is not correct to say that the President has not been interested in deficit reduction. That is not true. It was the Republican leadership in this House that walked away from a big package. So I think it is troublesome that you come here apparently saying you're going to vote for this bill by launching an unfair, untrue representation of what's been going on. So I want it to be very clear, because my guess is that the chairman will talk again, that there has been a permanent level of revenue set by this bill. That is not correct. And if that's an effort to get votes on your side, I want the record to be clear. So I'm going to close by reading from the President's statement of yesterday. I want to make clear that any agreement we have to deal with these automatic spending cuts that are being threatened for next month, those also have to be balanced, because remember, my principle has always been, let's do things in a balanced, responsible way. Now, the same is true for any future deficit agreement. Obviously, we are going to have to do more to reduce our debt and our deficit. I am willing to do more. He already has done substantial. But it's going to have to be balanced. We're going to have to do it in a balanced way. And then he talks about the need to address Medicare.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
We've heard some talk about what does the fiscal cliff mean, and I would say that I agree with my friend from Maryland that if we didn't address this fiscal cliff issue, every single American would see a tax increase. And it would be a big tax increase. It would be the biggest tax increase in the history of the country. So that's why it's so important we're here tonight acting in a permanent way. And I would say also to my friend from Michigan, he's correct. This is a permanent tax policy. These are permanent tax provisions we're putting in this bill, and that permanently sets the baseline, that permanently sets how much money the government can take out of the economy. Now, because of this, this is the largest tax cut in American history. And I think that's helpful because the best way to get out of our debt and deficit is to grow our economy. And we can do that through comprehensive and fundamental tax reform. And this is just the first step to getting to the ability to strengthen our economy, create the jobs we so badly need. We've had years of anemic economic growth. We have projected anemic economic growth in 2013. It is so important that we try to create jobs and grow the economy, and we can do that through comprehensive pro-growth tax reform that lowers rates, broadens the base, and simplifies a tax code that is far too complex. As I said in my opening statement, the tax code's a nightmare, and it is, and it's getting almost late enough to have a nightmare ourselves. But let me just say that we not only need to grow the economy, but we also need to address the fundamental causes of our debts and deficits, and that's out-of-control spending, obligations that we have not got the financial wherewithal to meet. We need to strengthen those programs and make sure that they're sustainable for the long term, but we also need to address the problem that is out-of-control spending. So this is the first step, permanent tax policy that then sets the stage for comprehensive and fundamental tax reform, and then addressing out-of-control spending. So this will be several steps. This is an important one. This is a critical one for the future of the country, and I urge a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for debate has expired pursuant to the Resolution 844. The previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kemp. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Ask for recorded vote.
Recorded vote is